I love the feature set that Nvidia offers with their GPUs, and to be honest, I secretly love the idea of Nvidia GPUs in the consoles. But I'm becoming concerned about a bit of a monopoly brewing. Team Green feels so far ahead that catching up with them feels like a bit of a mammoth task. And that feels like it brings some existential questions to a truly quote unquote free market. Could any company ever have the capital to catch up to Nvidia at this point? I struggle to balance the moral compass in my head over wanting the quote unquote best product versus wanting a quote unquote healthy market. Whilst acknowledging the feature set on Nvidia GPUs is super compelling, it is perhaps a good thing they're not in consoles to perhaps allow for a semblance of a competitive market in the GPU space. Oliver, it's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think slash hope slash sort of believe that AMD will get there on the machine learning stuff on the hardware end. They will figure out a solution that works for them. I have to imagine it's got to happen, right? It's really got to happen.
Yeah.
And then it's just a question at that point, once you have performant hardware or performant enough hardware, right? Doesn't need to be within the same, 10%, 20% of NVIDIA, but as long as it's in the same zip code, you can do something with it. And then it's just a question of getting the right solutions in the software end. We've seen cross-vendor solutions like XeSS already work pretty decently on AMD cards, more recent AMD cards. So it really is just a question, I think, at that point of getting the software solutions. And obviously, NVIDIA is enormously ahead in the software solutions with DLSS 3.5 rig reconstruction. But if you look at like DLSS 2, the more traditional upscaler, you have a lot of DLSS 2 competitors at this point, some machine learning based, some that offer pretty comparable quality. So I think that that's totally like, again, all this stuff is achievable after the hardware power is there, or maybe even before the hardware power is there, because obviously XeSS runs pretty well on some AMD GPUs. I do think it's legitimate to worry about, and I do worry a little bit about AMD's market share, but AMD's market share has basically always been quite depressed relative to NVIDIA's. So whatever their 15 or 20% is at this point of discrete GPU sales, I don't think it's something to worry about inordinately relative to the amount you'd be worried about it in the past, because that's always been the position. And AMD obviously has a very healthy console market, and they have a healthy data center market as well to feed their products into. So I don't think it's an enormous worry for the health of that company's GPU offerings.
Okay. John?
Oh, not too much to add to that. I think Oliver's right, but I will say that it does. The point about, oh man, it does create these questions. Like, you don't want to accept a lesser product. Just I'm going to go with this because I want them to be able to compete. But then I don't know, man, because I also want the best. But you're right. Like, having just essentially a monopoly would not be good. And it does feel like AMD's, but I feel like AMD has always kind of played second fiddle to everyone somehow, but they've continued to still do well and thrive. Like, I mean, I remember the days of Pentium versus all the early, that when they introduced the K6. It feels like AMD's always been in this situation where they're just like the underdog, and they've very rarely been able to pull out of it. And they do seem to rely on these other businesses as well, which Nvidia does too. But I mean, I hope, like Oliver says, they can actually figure out some of their hardware deficiencies and start to compete in this other area as well, because that would be good for everyone.
It's an interesting contention, but I think that AMD has proven to be competitive in different ways, right? For whatever reason, basically every major console up until the Switch from essentially Xbox One onwards has been AMD based, right? And the reason that they are AMD based is that fundamentally AMD gave them a better deal than Nvidia. And then, of course, there's the whole, the sort of beef that sort of emerged from prior Nvidia deals.
Oh yeah,
which have been well documented. The whole thing with the original Xbox, and the sense that PlayStation 3 GPU was kind of like that Nvidia had Sony over a barrel because they couldn't go anywhere else for a GPU, and the GPU is probably the worst aspect of the PlayStation 3. Yeah. So there are sort of outstanding issues that would cause that would require ironing out to make an Nvidia console GPU happen outside of the Nintendo arena. There was issues before in the past. I think that Nvidia wouldn't allow ownership of an IP. I think that was one of the issues with the original Xbox, possibly. Anyway, they couldn't cost reduce the original Xbox, and that was apparently down to Nvidia, so that caused issues. AMD steps in with favourable terms, and to be fair, they've produced some really great GPUs for consoles over the years. Yeah. What's happening now in recent years is that Nvidia are actually pushing ahead with new features that are actually redefining what potentially a video game can be, and that's kind of why we're looking at stuff like the concept of an Nvidia GPU being in the next Xbox. If Nvidia is dominating PCs so dramatically, it makes sense, if you're Microsoft, potentially to align with all of those innovations that just keep on coming. It's down to AMD to basically fight back, really, and they've got a great track record of fighting back within specific scopes. I don't think you can argue at this point that Zen has been nothing more than a totally unmitigated success, right? The CPU market landscape has completely changed there. Obviously, there was some complacency on their rival, which they don't have with Nvidia.
Yeah.
But, they are a rich company now. AMD are a very well-funded company. They're doing great things. It's up to them now to step forward to be more competitive. And it'll be interesting to see just whether it is the case that, AMD being the default choice for GPUs persists into the next generation, because there is, a lot of competition there now. It is, you always want the underdog to do well, right?
Yep.
And in the graphics space, AMD is undoubtedly the underdog, certainly in the PC space. But they've held their own in handhelds, they've held their own in consoles, and it's down to them basically to come up with something competitive. And that's kind of it, really. I don't think it's really down to the consumer to be worried about this stuff. It's ultimately AMD have got to compete and come up with great products. And, that's the nature of a free market, right?